Welcome to the 32nd in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. And today we're going to finish what we were talking about last time, which is the Tanzimat, Ottomanism, and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, as well as begin our next session, Moroccans with artillery, Sa'adians to Alaouites. For those who are familiar, permit me to explain the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, politics, or any of the subjects that we're going to be discussing today. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm just a layperson who enjoys this and is trying to give this from a secular perspective, right? We're going to touch upon some religious topics. In each case, I'm trying to address it from that secular historical perspective. Let's be respectful of the of the subject matter. But that said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications are always welcome. Please put them in the chat. I do read the chat, and I will respond in time. As I always say, classes are a 101 and a 201, meaning if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already knew something, I'll probably teach you something you didn't know. When I give dates for people, those are the years of service. That's not their birth and death, although it can be their death in certain cases. I like to do what's called a 2-hour hard stop, which means that if we get to that 2-hour mark and I've already and there's still more slides, which is probably going to happen tonight. That's okay. That's where we'll stop, and we'll let some of that roll over into next week. And finally, this is a recording like the other 31 episodes, and you can watch it later accordingly. All right. There is no quiz today, given how much we have to do. So, part 1, finishing Tanzimat, Ottomanism, and the Russo-Turkish Wars. So, we've been going through this situation where we've looked at the 1800s in the Ottoman Empire following 3 distinct tracks. The first track we followed was the Balkan revolutions. The next we followed was Napoleon Muhammad Ali Pasha, and that took us 2 weeks. And now we were finishing the Tanzimat, Ottomanism, and the Russo-Turkish War. And similar to the Two Towers, these are 3 tracks that are sort of in the same time period, in the same empire. And of course, there's necessarily interplay between all of them. But it's really important to sort of see them individually, to sort of follow the progress and understand what's going on. So we had discussed how Mahmud II really started building the apparatus for a modern army, which he called the Asakir Mansure Mohammedia, the victorious army of Muhammad. And he used Western training in chemistry and in warfare, translating tactical manuals in order to build universities and colleges that could teach this kind of war. We also talked about how the Janissaries as a political class were eliminated in the auspicious incident in 1826. And we talked about how the process of conscription began in the Ottoman Empire, with the first census being taken in nearly 300 years. The last previous census was in 1526. And that census was almost exclusively in Turkey, indicated with blue squares, or in the European provinces, indicated with orange squares. Of the Ottoman Empire, the census really couldn't penetrate much beyond Anatolia. And one of the other things that comes out of this census, other than conscription, is that it leads to the abolition of the tax farms, which of course alienates the Sultanate from a number of the ions and notables in the Middle Eastern parts of the empire. We then talked about the creation of Tanzimat, or this reordering, led by Mustafa Rashid Pasha. And it begins with the Hadith Sharif Gulhane, the Edict of the Rose-Colored Chamber in 1839, which sets up a number of different aspects that will be changing in the way the Ottoman Empire governs things. We're talking about a reorganization of taxes and a standardization of the military, equality for all Ottomans, regardless of religion, public trials, rule of law, security for all the people throughout the state, and a central bureaucracy. All of these are things that existed in Western Europe, of course, and in other parts of Europe to varying degrees. But the Ottoman Empire was really focusing on emulating the liberal countries of Western Europe, namely France and Britain. All right, when I say liberal, I'm talking about people who wanted governments based on written constitutions that empowered the bourgeoisie, established constitutional republics, and saw the secular overpowering the religion or religious aspect of life. And the government was designed to protect private citizens, as opposed to conservatives who genuinely wanted to preserve the older institutions, holding that these institutions had provided peace for longer periods of time, and liberal policies were necessarily unstable because they didn't go with an established bureaucracy or established monarchies. Ottomanism was this idea that every citizen within the Ottoman Empire, every subject of the Sultan, would actually be part of a new Ottoman fabric. And it was based on symbols of Ottoman history, certainly, but those systems would be, despite the fact that they may be Muslim in nature, would apply to all the citizens of the empire, including Christians and Jews. And it would be a relative flattening of the social distinctions that had previously existed for the different religious minorities. Many of these religious minorities were saw it positively in that they would be further integrated and be able to have opportunities that they'd previously not had. And in other cases, they were angry that the specific privileges and benefits that they had managed to achieve as minority groups would be removed from them. For example, they would now have to testify in Muslim-dominated courts. The courts were now split in terms of their judges, but it meant that Jews would not be adjudicated by Jewish law, Christians would not be adjudicated by Christian law, all would be adjudicated by Ottoman law. And there was a sense that citizens should be loyal to the Ottoman Empire as opposed to loyal to their particular region or religious group, and following this large-scale bureaucracy towards a new tomorrow. This idea of Ottomanism, this idea of Ottoman identity, was really the dominant center of politics. All right. And we talked about how leading up to the Crimean War, Mustafa Rashid achieved the diplomatic coup of bringing the British and the French onto the Ottoman side, and the Ottomans were able to inflict a massive defeat on Russia, although the Ottomans had very little to do with that victory, right? The victory was mostly at the hands of the French and the British. The Ottoman forces, while there were some moments of strength, like in the siege of Silistra, by and large, it was the British and French forces that besieged Sevastopol and won the war. In fact, the Turkish fleet had been destroyed by the Russians at the Battle of Sinop, and in order to secure the Turkish Black Sea Fleet, the Russians were forbidden from building a new Black Sea Fleet and had to be demilitarized from a naval perspective. We also saw the Treaty of Paris, which resulted in the Ottoman Empire joining the constituted nations and the equality of Christians being recognized to the extent where the provisions of the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, which allowed European interference with Ottoman affairs with regards to the Christian minorities who were unequally treated, sort of becoming abrogated. Now, one of the important things that we also notice is that the Ottoman Empire really has a difficult post-mortem after Crimea. You have the situation where the 1/3 of the Ottoman military that participated in the Crimean War did not return, whether they died of malnutrition, deaths on the battlefield, and other issues. This was a very high rate, and even the Egyptian troops that were sent by the Wali at the time, Abbas Hilmi, were superior to the Ottoman forces. And so it made it very clear that the Ottomans had a lot of catching up to do still, even though they'd been moving at a breathtaking pace. And of course, as I pointed out, the Europeans force the Ottoman Empire to declare the true equality of all Ottoman citizens before the law, and that all Ottoman citizens would become eligible, all male Ottoman citizens would be eligible for conscription, which was something that most of the minorities that had previously been subject to unequal laws were less than happy about. So where we left off was here, right? We left off at this point where we were talking about the Young Ottomans. And the Young Ottomans were generally in favor of the Tanzimat reforms to the extent that they were promoting this Ottoman identity, promoting this sense of liberal orientation as opposed to conservative orientation. They were on board with this larger project. Where they were not on board with was the organization of that project. So this is a debate, if you've been following our European Union discussions, or if you're following American politics, you'll recognize this debate almost immediately. When the leaders of Tanzimat, Mustafa Rashid Pasha, Emin Ali Pasha, Fuad Pasha, were organizing the principles and legislation, that this was an entirely top-down operation. This was a situation where where these leaders would dictate what the principles were that they wanted to espouse, how the law would achieve that, and then that's what they would do. And Namik Kemal and Ibrahim Shinasi, among other individuals, but these are probably the two most famous, wrote back saying, no, that the Tanzimat reforms should not be a top-down process. It should be one that is democratically engaged with by the local population. We don't need the government telling us what to do. We can be part of that process. We should have a parliament or some sort of democratic institution whereby we can express our will and interest in terms of developing a new Ottoman state. And we see within the Ottoman Empire the first elements of modern political agitation that had never been used before. While there had been printing presses in the Ottoman Empire before this point, they had never really been used to a political end, as they had, for example, in Egypt with the Bulaq press that we saw 2 episodes ago. Namik Kemal, in particular, used the Ottoman press in order to disseminate his views. And he was a prolific writer. He wrote both poetry and prose works. Namik Kemal in particular, tended to write about his understanding of the concept of Ottomanism and how he felt that there was something about the Muslim religion that had something to do with Ottoman character. There was something about the Turkish language that had something to do with Ottoman character, but at the same time, it was an identity and a reality that non-Turkish Muslim Ottomans could also engage with, and it had something to do with the institutions and history of the Ottoman experience. Namik Kemal was declared an enemy of the state by Emin Ali Pasha, and he relocated to Geneva, but he continued to put his work out there by using the presses in Europe and spreading that into Turkey circuitously. Ibrahim Shinasi was a little bit more of a rationalist, but that said, he also stressed this idea of democracy, and he also stressed the idea of a moral center of government, that Islam should be part of the Ottoman state, just like Namik Kemal said it should be, but it should be a part of the state in terms of creating a moral compass, right? There's the Islamic principle that the state should enjoin good, right? It should promote good things and it should forbid evil things. And so this caretaker aspect of the state, this sort of moral guidance aspect of the state, was something that Shinasi strongly promoted. And together, they and a number of other dissidents are collectively called the Young Ottomans, despite the fact that aside from arguing that Islam has something to do with the Turkish identity, they were not Islamists. They were not interested in creating a theocratic state, but they believed that there was something Muslim about the Ottoman Empire, and that should be represented in the politics of its government and its foundational values. They also even more strongly believed that the Tanzimat should be accomplished via a parliamentary system as opposed to a top-down bureaucratic system. Now, of course, we have to remember that this is the same time that we have the massive Circassian resettlement from the genocide that takes place in the Russian territories. And 700,000 to 800,000 Circassians are resettled within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. And these become effective shock troops for the Sultan to use against the various groups, especially the groups in Romania, in modern Bulgaria, that are becoming less and less complacent with Ottoman authority. In a certain way, the Circassians, which themselves were a displaced minority, then became the ones who were part of the Ottoman state apparatus to displace other populations within the Ottoman Empire in a way of paying, in a sort of sad way of paying the hurt forward. Of course, the Circassians had very little control over this, where they were settled, what kind of power that they had, and to the point that they were active in promoting this, the agenda of the various sultans. It should be couched in the fact that they really had no other alternative, and the Ottoman Empire was really the only country that took them in after being expelled from Russia. So we then have one of the massive developments that occurred during the 1870s, and that is the creation of the Majalat al-Ahkam al-Adaliyah, commonly known in English and in Turkish as the Mecelle. The Mecelle was a codification according to a Napoleonic style legal codex of the Shari'a, specifically the Shari'a of the Hanafi fiqh. So what does that actually mean in terms of what Ahmed Jevdet Pasha, the author, among many authors, but he was the primary author, in terms of what Ahmed Jevdet Pasha was doing? And why is this so revolutionary? The Islamic legal system, for those who are more familiar with the Jewish legal system or any other case law system, is organized as a set of questions about legal circumstances and the responses to those questions. For example, if a man discovers that his wife has been adulterous, what is the punishment for her? The punishment for her is XXY, right? So it's not listed in the order of like a template or an outline, which is how legal codes are organized, right? And a legal code is set up in such a way that a judge simply goes to the index, looks at the section, pulls up the section, and reads it. And this is the way that French law is organized today. This is the way that most countries actually organize their laws. The United States and most countries influenced heavily by the United Kingdom are really the distinctive parties here, and the countries that rule almost dominantly by the Sharia are the exclusive groups that don't really behave by this rule of having a codified system. And so in the French model, you begin to have the Mecelle codified. And you can see on the right-hand side, this is a French translation written by one of the last Fanariote dragomans, Demetrius Nicolaides. And Demetrius Nicolaides, as you can tell by the name, he's Greek. But he wrote this in French in order to disseminate it to France and to the international community to understand what the Ottoman civil code now was. This canonization of Islamic law that would now apply to all the populations of the Ottoman Empire because of the system that was now in place. That would end the distinctions between the various religious minorities. And this sort of sees the phasing out of the Fanariotes as a power base within Ottoman society in exchange for a new Sharia-compliant bureaucracy. It's also an interesting change in terms of the dispensing of judgment, because now with this Mecelle, there is a standardized system by which the judges of the Ottoman Empire need to judge cases. And it means that the erratic decisions of the Sultan are now removed from his power and put in the hands of the bureaucrats. And so you begin to see this tug of war of which the Mecelle is probably the clearest example, but there are other examples where the Council of Tanzimat, the Committee of Tanzimat, headed at this point by Emin Ali Pasha, until he dies in 1871, is concentrating more power in the bureaucracy, and the Sultan is less and less able to pull power back to the authority, the absolute authority of the Sultan. We also see a period of immense discord within the Ottoman Empire. In particular, we see what's called the Three Sultans in 3 years. Sultan Abdulaziz dies in 1876. He is replaced by Murad V, who rules for a few months, but is found to be relatively insane and removed from power for the benefit of the Ottoman state. And Abdülhamid II, who would eventually come to reign for nearly 3 decades, was brought into power. But because of this, there was a lot of turmoil within the empire, and the Grand Vizier Ahmad-Šeikh Midhat Pasha was able to impose upon Abdülhamid II at the very beginning of his tenure some requirements in order for him to replace Murad V. And one of them is that he was a supporter of the Young Ottoman proposal of creating a parliament. And with the death of Emin Ali Pasha in 1871, Namik Kemal and a number of the other young Ottomans who'd been forced out of the empire came back in and became increasingly popular with their desire to create this kind of Ottoman state for all Ottomans. And they do create this parliament in 1876. It is inaugurated, and it is inaugurated with the creation of the first Ottoman constitution, the Kanuni Osmani Esasi, or the Basic Ottoman Law. You can see a copy of it on the left-hand side in Ottoman Turkish. And the Kanuni Osmani Esasi gave specific rights to the parliament in terms of how it could convene, what kinds of laws it could have, and to what extent the Sultan had to listen to it or had the power to close it. Now, to say that the elections in 1876 went poorly is an understatement. There were massive problems in terms of the vote, and we see this in many nascent democracies and quasi-democracies today. One of the ones in particular that was most commonly seen was that the ions, or the nobles in the various provinces, influenced people very strongly to vote for candidates that supported their agendas. And we have instances of vote buying, we have instances of coercion, and these are not singular instances, but numerous across the Ottoman Empire, where the ions have effectively managed to control the voting process, and that resulted in a parliament that reflected many of the old aristocratic tendencies within the Ottoman Empire, rather than an actual representation of the majority of either bourgeoisie or peasants within the empire. Another major issue is that the rule of law had never properly been established. So you didn't have proper debating techniques. There wasn't a key recognition of the right of parliamentarian speakers to speak. There wasn't any clear understanding of how votes would be counted and tabulated, which made the whole affair rather raucous. You can see a picture of the Ottoman Parliament in the center in 1877. That was the second convocation. And it was a little bit better then, but the picture sort of doesn't show just how confused and noisy the situation was. There was representation for Jews and Christians, and they elected their own religiously affiliated representatives. The equality had not quite happened to the point where Jews and Christians were voting and being voted on as Ottoman citizens. They were being voted on as members of their specific religious groups. Now, of the religious minorities, those who were not rabbinical Jews, Sunni Muslims, or one of the recognized Christianities, those individuals did not have representation in the parliament. We're talking about, for example, the Druze, the Shiites, the Karaite Jews, the Catholics. All of these groups were not recognized as religions under the system of the millets before, and so they did not have representatives in parliament for their religion. And compounding the problems facing this parliament was the fact that in 1875, just 1 year earlier, the Ottoman Empire had declared bankruptcy on all of the loans that it had been taking out to engage in all these modernization reforms. So that resolving that bankruptcy was the first object of the parliament. And of course, choosing how to pay a bankruptcy is the one thing that you're sure is going to alienate every constituency, because no constituency wants to pay the money for that. So with this backdrop of a new Ottoman parliament forming, we begin to see problems resurfacing in the Balkans. And we talked a little bit about this on the Balkan nationalism side. But suffice it to say that these revolts in 1875, 1876 were put down relatively easily. The Ottoman Empire had the strength and power within its own borders to put down any resistance movement. And the resistance movement of Montenegro, which was nominally independent. But the problem is that after the Ottomans put down these revolts, they engaged in numerous massacres. You can see a painting in the upper left of the Batak massacre that was visited on the Bulgarians after their failed uprising in 1876, which is called the April Uprising. And the word about these massacres and these repudiations was intense, which led to the Ottomans basically being forced to weather the international spotlight for these abuses against those populations. And with the defeat or near defeat of the Serbians and Bulgarians, the Russians decided that they had enough political capital on their side to launch a war against the Ottomans in reprisal for the way that they had been treating these revolutions. And so then we get to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, where the Russians intervene on the side of the Serbs and Bulgarians against the Ottoman forces. And the war can be divided into two fronts. There's the Balkan front and the Caucasian front, and we'll get to each of those. On the Balkan front, this is the side that is more famous. In particular, you have the Battle of Shipka Pass. In the center of Bulgaria, there's a mountain range that separates the northern part of Bulgaria from the southern part of Bulgaria. And if I can draw it on the map, you can see it roughly around here. This is where those mountains run, and it makes it very difficult to reinforce troop positions north of that line if you are coming from south of that line, which is exactly what the situation was in the Ottoman Empire. Now, there were a few passes that existed to move armaments through, and one of them was Shipka Pass. The Bulgarian forces that were there, along with Russians, but the Bulgarians were more numerous, decided to hold their position regardless of the Ottoman attack on Shipka Pass in order to pass material through to the north. And the Bulgarians fought with everything they had. You can see this painting commemorating the battle, and you can see the Bulgarians were very disordered, throwing rocks, hitting people with the back of their guns because they'd run out of bullets, anything they could do to hold back the Ottomans. And surprisingly, they were actually successful, and they maintained the ability to hold Shipka Pass. And this is recorded on the Bulgarian side as one of their great victories, one of their great moments in their nationalist struggle. One of the other things that we should point out about the Caucasian front is that the navy of the Russians was back in force in the Black Sea again. And this would sound surprising, considering we learned in the Crimean War that the Russians were required to destroy their entire Black Sea fleet and were forbidden from creating one. The reason for this is that the Russian foreign minister, Alexander Gorchakov, was able to negotiate with Germany in order to pressure the other powers, in order to permit the Russians to rebuild their Black Sea Fleet in 1874. And so by this point, the Russians managed to bombard Ottoman positions from the water. We also see the siege of Nicopolis. For those who have been following this series for a long time, you can probably remember back to episode 17 or 18 when we talked about the crusade at Nicopolis in 1396, where Bayezid the Thunderbolt, Bayezid I, held back a crusading army led by King Sigismund of Hungary that tried to take the city at Nicopolis. So the fall of this city to Bulgarian and Russian forces in 1877 was seen as a major cultural loss by the Ottoman Empire, because it sort of heralded the end of Ottoman control in the Balkans altogether. And there's one particular story I want to tell, and that's the story of Osman Nuri Pasha. You can see him in the upper left-hand side. Osman Nuri Pasha is probably the most decorated general in the entire history of the Ottoman Empire, and he was an incredible general and tactician, and he was in charge of defending the Turkish military bastion at Plevna. The Russians and Bulgarians besieged his position, and he led several sorties, fighting as best as he could. But when the Battle of Shipka Pass prevented reinforcements from coming and relieving his position, he was caught and was forced to surrender in his last sortie against the Russians when he had no material left. He was treated honorably by the Russians and returned to Istanbul after the war, where he was given the title of Field Marshal of the Empire. But still to this day, there is what's called the Plevna Marche, or the Plevna March, which is a Turkish song commemorating the loss of Plevna, and how difficult it was to surrender that fortress to the Russians after fighting so valiantly in its defense. We then turn to the Caucasian front, and the Caucasian front moves from territory that is currently on the border between on the border between Georgia and Armenia on the Russian imperial side, and Turkey on the western side. The borders are not exact, but after the war, the territory controlled by the Russian Empire digs deep into what is today Turkey. And the major attack was centered on first the city of Dolbayzet, and then from there to Kars, leading from a number of Georgian cities. And what's really interesting to point out here is that you had large-scale Armenian participation in this war on the Russian side. And to point this out, these are Armenians who lived in the territory of Russia. If you remember back one or few episodes, we mentioned that in the territory of what is now modern Armenia, you had the process of re-Armenification, where the Russian government encouraged Armenian people to return to that territory that had been historically Armenian, but was only 20% Armenian at the time of 1826. And so by this point, you had large Armenian populations that were incredibly loyal to the Russian government in the Russian imperial side of the Armenian homeland. And so of the generals that coordinated the attack, there was one chief general and 4 subordinate generals. All 4 of the subordinate generals were Russian Armenians. You can see one of those, that's Hovhannes Davidi Lazarian. I think his Russian name was Ivan Davidovich Lazarevich, right? Because of course the Russians change all their surnames, but Hovhannes Davidi Lazarian was his Armenian name. And he led a number of battles, especially around the city of Kars. Another ethnic group that's worth pointing out here are the Kurds. And we're going to talk more about the Kurds probably in May. But what's really interesting here about the Kurds is that the Kurds had a degree of autonomy in the eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire, and where you get closer to the Iraqi border as well. And you had a number of Kurds who marshaled their forces to fight alongside the Ottoman soldiers, but you had families like that of Abdülrezik Badir Khan, who actually fought on the Russian side, hoping for a Russian victory in Kars, believing that the modernization attempts of the Ottoman Empire, all the Tanzimat reforms, would eventually lead to their disempowerment and lead to a federalization of their territories. And so they would rather be under the Russians, where they could negotiate some sort of deal similar to how the Caucasian republics, in many respects, had a degree of autonomy in the Russian Empire. And of course, a discussion of the war of Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 would be incomplete without a discussion of the massive number of massacres that occurred during the war. Those on the Muslim side are on the left-hand side of the screen. Those on the Christian side are on the right-hand side of the screen. In particular, you can see the execution of the Bashi Bozouks. The Bashi Bozouks were sort of these bullies is sort of a strong word for it. Irregular military units that generally attacked the Bulgarian population. Those who did not flee with the Ottoman army that retreated towards Istanbul were captured by the Bulgarians and hung. But it wasn't just Bashi Bozouks that were hung. We have estimates of hundreds of thousands of Turks who were forced to leave their homes in what's today Bulgaria. Remember that Bulgaria had regions of Turkish majority settlement because of Rumelia, because of the Timariot and all of these kinds of things that were based in what is today Bulgaria. You had hundreds of thousands of Turkish people living in Bulgaria, and most of them had to leave. You can see the Turkish refugees from Tarnava forming a cavalcade there. Those were the ones who escaped. Many others were not as lucky. You also, when we see that the Turks are compelled to leave a settlement, almost always the Jews are compelled to leave with them. In many cases, the Jews were seen by the Bulgarians and the Russians to be complicit with the Ottoman Empire. And given that the Jews received better treatment under the Ottoman Empire than they could expect to receive from the Christian Slavs, it's not unreasonable to think that they would have preferred an Ottoman victory. There's no evidence that they collaborated, though. On the right-hand side, we have massacres of Bulgarians. This is Stara Zagora, which is probably the largest single massacre of Bulgarians in the war. 2/3 of the Bulgarians that were killed were in Stara Zagora or the area around it. It was one of the largest cities of Bulgaria, if not the largest in terms of population before the war. 15,000, it's estimated, Bulgarians were massacred. And you can see in the mausoleum the heads of those victims piled high. You can still go to Stara Zagora and see that in Bulgaria to this day in commemoration for the martyrs. You also have Armenians from the areas that remained part of the Ottoman Empire after the war, fleeing into Georgia and what is now modern Armenia, because of the Circassians who the Ottoman Empire sent along with Kurds to attack the Armenian population, the Armenian civilian populations that they considered to be in alliance with the Armenian military populations that were part and parcel of the Russian military, despite the fact that there was no evidence that the Armenian civilian population was in any way coordinating, helping, or providing cover to the Russians. Now, one of the things that I didn't cover on the Caucasian front, and if you see it very closely, the Russians pursued the Ottomans all the way to Stan Stefano, which is just outside of Constantinople. And you can see those red arrows moving slowly southward towards Constantinople. By the time the Ottoman Empire sued for peace because of how close the Russians were to attacking Istanbul, it meant that the Russians would be able to pretty much dictate any terms that they wanted to the Ottomans. And so the terms that they dictated included the following. they would take all of the territory that they had conquered in the Caucasus. You can see the Caucasus expansion on the right side of the screen, including the what's now the Ajara region of Georgia and the Kars region of Turkey. They would also take a significant amount of territory for Bulgaria, which includes both the modern states of Bulgaria and Macedonia, along with some territories that belong to modern-day Greece and modern-day Turkey. And some of those territories, including, for example, the city of Vidin, are part of modern-day Serbia. Now, this massive Bulgaria was something that the great powers were not in favor of. And they would make changes to this agreement at St. Stefano. But before we leave this page, there were two other things that I wanted to point out. The first is that with the independence of Bulgaria, the independence of Serbia that would be guaranteed, the independence of Greece, the populations of Albania realized that without organization, their territories would become subsumed eventually by these independent Christian states. And the Albanians were a mix of Sunni, Bektashi, Catholic, and Orthodox populations, all united by their Albanianness, but still generally divided by clans and organization. And so they had to come together as a League of Prizren, and the League of Prizren existed in 4 different vilayets of the Ottoman Empire, and you can see them on the left-hand side. And this is really the first time that the Albanians begin to organize under anything close to a nationalistic banner. And Albanian nationalism doesn't really develop until the 20th century. But this is the thing that pushes it, because as you can see, the cities of Ohrid and Koče are territories that are very close, if not within, Albanian majority territory. And the other piece is that in order for the Ottoman Empire to get the great powers to assist them in rewriting the Treaty of San Stefano, the Ottoman Empire had to make a concession. And so that concession was to Britain to give them control of the island of Cyprus in 1878. And as recompense for this, the British helped negotiate with Otto von Bismarck of Germany a more stable solution, which required a much smaller Bulgaria. You can see Bulgaria is divided between a north and a southern region. The southern region is Eastern Rumelia, and Eastern Rumelia was not independent. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It would eventually, as a vassal state, it would eventually become independent and become part of Bulgaria, but that would take a few years. The territory of Romania was also changed. The territory of Serbia was expanded, and so was some of the territory of Montenegro. You can see it in blue. You can see it in that sort of bluish purple color. And the Ottoman Empire got some of its lands back. You can see the outline of Greater Bulgaria that was recognized by St. Stefano in sort of the brown on this map, and how much territory the Bulgarians actually lost under the Congress of Berlin of 1878. But 1878 is also the closing chapter on this Tanzimat and Ottomanism discussion, because Sultan Abdülhamid II uses the fact that there is chaos throughout the Ottoman Empire, there are rebellions throughout the country, people are unhappy with the war effort, the budget can't be resolved, all these major issues. He decides to permanently close the parliament and begin to establish his own absolute power bureaucracy at Yıldız Palace, starting in 1880. Starting in 1880, it's in Yıldız Palace, but prior to that, in 1878, he ends the parliament and begins an authoritarian rule that will stretch until the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. And we're going to cover all of that stuff eventually. But that sort of closes the door on this chapter of Ottoman history. And while Abdülhamid II was forward-thinking, he would not entertain bureaucrats or parliamentarians telling him what to do and constraining his political aspirations. So any questions on the Ottomans before we shift gears? Okay. So now we switch to the Moroccans. So some basic review, we'd seen that Morocco only fell to the Umayyad Caliphate during the third invasion of the Maghreb, led by Musa ibn Nusayr, because they had fought against armed resistance throughout the north, the Maghreb region, that northwest region of Africa. In particular, they had fought against Cassilis and Kahina, Berber chieftains in what is today Algeria. But eventually we see the Moroccans become part of the Islamic world. And we should sort of do a quick note on the different ethnicities in Morocco. There are three dominant Berber ethnicities. You have the Zenata in the north, the Masmuda in the mountains, which run along the backbone of Morocco, and you have the Songhai, which live in the desert to the south. We've seen Moroccan dynasties from all three of these different Amazigh or Berber ethnicities. For example, we've seen the Almohads from the Masmuda. We've seen the Almoravids from the Songhai, and we've seen the Idrisids from the Zenata. Now we have a fourth group, and those are the Sharifians. The Sharifians claim to be true Arabs, meaning that their heritage comes from Arabia, and that they moved to Morocco with the early colonization of Morocco by Arabs during the Arab conquests. So one of the things worth discussing, and it's something that we hadn't really highlighted, was the gold trade that occurred between Morocco and the African states. In particular, you had the state of Ouagadougou. Ouagadougou is commonly called the state of Ghana, but Ghana is incorrect. Ghana is the name of their leader. Similarly to the title of king or sultan, the leader of Ouagadougou was called Ghana or Ghana. And you can see the Ghana Tunkamenin, who is probably the most powerful of the Ghana in Ouagadougou, ruling over the people from his capital in Kumbisale. Ghana, by and large, was made of Soninke peoples who still live in what's today the country of Mali. And they were very lucky in that their region, the exact borders we don't know, because by and large the people of Ouagadougou were illiterate. So the only things we know about them are the things that Arabs decided to tell us about them. But those areas became incredibly wealthy through the gold trade. And you can see the gold indicated on this map by areas of orange. Those are where those gold deposits are, and they would be collected from the river. So those gold deposits would be small little pearls that you would get from moving, straining through the water, and then retrieving that gold. And the trade that developed during the time of Ghana, during the time of Ghana Tunkamenin, was a salt for gold trade, where these things were traded pound for pound, and the salt would come from Tagaza or Tawadeni. You can see those on the map of Western Africa on the right hand side, and you can see the camels pulling salt blocks. For those who are unfamiliar, because of the way that chemically salt exists, it can be cut literally into squares. And that's how you carry it. So those are actually blocks of salt that are carved out of the mine and brought down to Ouagadougou for trading. And those trade routes included ones that go to Morocco. If you look at the northwestern side of the map, you can see trade routes that go from Adarost, just north of the area of Ouagadougou, to Sijil Massa, which was Morocco's door to the south, and then from Sijil Massa to the other major cities of Morocco, like Marrakesh or like Fez. Now, during this period, Moroccans come south as diplomats, as traders, as scribes, and many Ghani and many Wagaduans convert to Islam during this period. Now, there is still some of the Dogon religion still today in Mauritania. It's maybe 3% of the population. But Dogon was the dominant religion in Mauritania before Islam replaced it. And Dogon is an animistic faith with beliefs about the spirits in various mountains, desert locations, flora and fauna. Eventually, Moroccan soldiers would come down, like the Almoravids, to try and conquer the territory. But those conquests, even though they took some of the border regions, like Aldarost, never were successful in taking Kumbisale. And you can see there the Almoravids at their greatest extent into Ouagadougou. Now, of course, they also pressed into Spain. The Almoravids, led by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, fought a major battle at a place called Azalaqa in Arabic, which is common to Spanish as Sagrajas. And that battle at Sagrajas secured Almoravid control over most of southern Spain. The Almoravids were replaced by the Almohads due to internal revolts, and the Almohads unified an entire empire. Now, the Almohads, as we discussed, were very fanatical. I think it wouldn't be too far to say that they were the Taliban of their day. They had a very strong aqidah, or statement of belief, and they engaged in numerous massacres of both Jews and Christians, as well as other Muslims who did not follow their level of piety. In particular, and we know that, for example, they raised mosques because they were not, at least to the opinion of the Almohads, pointed properly at Mecca and reoriented by them by even fractions of a degree. But after the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, which we remember from our discussions of the Crusades, as well as our discussion of Andalus, the Almohads were fighting a losing battle in the Spanish Peninsula. We then have the replacement of Ouagadougou with a new civilization called Mali. And within Mali, you have the creation of the wealthiest person in history, probably, who is Mansa Musa. Mansa being their title for ruler, so Musa is his actual name. And Mansa Musa decided to take a pilgrimage, a Hajj, to Mecca. And when he made this Hajj, he gave out so much gold that the value of gold in Egypt deflated for 12 years. So we get to this point where the Almohads control most of northern Africa and southern Spain, but increasingly as we move towards 1300, the Almohads collapse due to internal strife, and their empire breaks really down into 4 constituent components. The Hafsids in Tunisia, which we've met. We met them when we were talking about the Eighth Crusade, and we met them when we were talking about the wars with the Ottoman Empire. With Tlemcen, which we met a little bit when we talked about Barbarossa, at Granada, which we talked about with Andalusia, and of course the Marinids. Now, the Marinids tried to recreate that situation that the Almohads, the Almoravids and Almohads did, where they invaded Spain and fought a key battle, and were therefore able to hold on to the southern part of Spain. And that was the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340. At this battle, the Castilian government was able to effectively rout the Marinid soldiers and defeat them along with the Emirate of Granada. That said, they couldn't pursue the Emirate of Granada beyond the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so Granada survived, but the Marinids would never return to Spain. That would be the last time that Moroccans would try to affect cross-border conquest. That said, the fact that the Spanish and Portuguese would never come under Moroccan sovereignty again doesn't mean that the reverse was true. In fact, for most Spanish and Portuguese, the reconquest would include a taking of Moroccan territory and would bring Christianity back to Morocco. It wasn't simply to liberate the Iberian Peninsula. And we see this with the Portuguese uh, as early as 1415. So this is nearly a century before the fall of Granada and the unification of Spain. Portugal sends its lead naval commander, Henry the Navigator, to take the city of Ceuta. Ceuta today is under Spanish rule, but you can see the flag of Ceuta, a version of the flag of Portugal, which is still the flag of Ceuta today because Ceuta was simply ceded to Spain in 1668. But with Henry the Navigator's taking of that city, there were numerous other embarkations that the Portuguese led all up and down the coast of Morocco. And you can see those on the left-hand side. Many of these cities have been renamed by either the Moroccans or were renamed by the Portuguese, and the Moroccans reverted to the original name. So some of these cities may be familiar to you if I use the common name that they're used by now. For example, the city of Anfa is the modern city of Casablanca. The city of Mogador is the modern city of Essaouira. The city of San João de Mamora is the city of Mehdia. And the Portuguese built these forts and were able to control the sea lanes moving across the coast of Morocco, but were unable to move beyond a small coastal veneer of control. In fact, with the exception of Brazil, in the 1400s and 1500s, the Portuguese Empire tended to be a naval empire as opposed to a land-based empire. Now, as I mentioned, we talked about Barbarossa and Algeria, and this was the Spanish interest in expanding into the African continent. You have in 1509 Spaniards arriving in Algiers, in the city of Oran, in the western part of Algeria, and conquering it from the local Zayyanid dynasty. In fact, they besieged the al-Mashwar palace. Barbarossa besieged the al-Mashwar palace, as we talked about in episode 24. We also talked about how the Spanish attacked Tunisia at this same time, going after the Hafsid dynasty. And even though it took 1 million gold ducats to outfit the fleet that would sail to Tunisia, the reason that the Spanish had it is that they had confiscated gold from the Inca Empire in 1534. That gold had managed to make its way to Spain, and now they could use it to pay for all these ships and launch this invasion. That said, the Spanish were able to keep the Hafsids in power and eject the Ottoman attempts to include Tunisia into the Ottoman Empire, at least for a short time. We also talked about, but in less detail, the situation in Morocco with the Wattasid dynasty. So in 1465, the Marinids have a number of serious difficulties and are unable to continue ruling. So a Berber dynasty called the Wattasids takes power, but they are unable to really deal with foreign threats. In the 1540s, the Wattasids have a number of different battles fighting the Portuguese. You can see there in the yellow. The Ottomans come over, led by Kara Hassan Pasha from Algeria. Kara Hassan Pasha is one of the descendants of Barbarossa. They fight against the Zayyanids of Tlemcen at certain points and require the help of the Spanish in order to secure their position. Now, this also happens that the Sa'adians reach out to the Spanish and are able to establish their dynasty. So we have this huge confluence of different things going on in Morocco, as the Wattasids are too weak to control power, and the Sa'adians under Moulay Muhammad aš-Šeikh begin to consolidate power around the city of Taroudant. You can see Taroudant is in the southern part of the modern country of Morocco. And from that point, Muhammad Muhammad aš-Šeikh is willing to make alliances with European leaders, especially the British, and begins to buy cannons from them. So his most effective use of cannons is actually at Agadir, which is a seaside city controlled by the Portuguese. And he builds a fortress called the Agadir Ufla, overlooking the city. And in that fortress, he puts his new cannons and pummels the city throughout the year of 1541, leading to an astonishing victory, forcing the Portuguese out. And he does this in a number of places throughout southern Morocco, consolidating his hold before he moves further north and removes the Wattasids from power. As I pointed out, he removes the Wattasids from power by joining with the Spanish. The Wattasids had tried to retain their position by reaching out to the Ottomans. And so the Ottomans and Spanish effectively fought a proxy war with Morocco being that battleground. And the Sa'adians eventually come out on top, resulting in a new organized Moroccan dynasty in the Sa'adians. But the coastal cities are, in many cases, are still controlled by the Portuguese. And so you begin to have a situation where the Portuguese are trying to reassert their power. And in particular, in 1578, there's the Battle of Al-Qasr Kibir. In this battle, we have the Portuguese supporting one Moroccan claimant to the Sa'adian throne, Muhammad II, and we have Abdülhamid I, the Moroccan Sultan, who is supported by the Ottoman forces, fighting them. This battle is incredibly destructive to all sides. Muhammad II dies, Sebastian I of Portugal dies, and Abdülhamid I of Morocco also dies. So both claimants to the title of king for Morocco, as well as the Portuguese king, die. So sometimes it's called the Battle of Three Kings. And the Portuguese forces are thoroughly surrounded and defeated by the Moroccan forces. Now, what ends up happening on the Portuguese side is tremendous. The death of Sebastian I pretty much leaves the Portuguese kingdom without a successor. And so Philip II, who was third in line to the Portuguese throne, argues that he should be the king of Portugal. The Portuguese nobles try to resist this, and this leads to the Portuguese War of Succession in 1580 to 1583, following which Philip II ruled Portugal as part of his crown domains, including Spain, until Portuguese restoration in 1640. So this battle in Morocco fundamentally changed the European paradigm and put Portugal on the defensive in terms of its worldwide colonies, because Philip II cared much more about the Spanish Empire than he did about maintaining the Portuguese Empire. And so many of the Portuguese cities began to be attacked by the English and the Dutch. Abdülhamid had given tribute to the Ottomans. That's why they had supported him during the war. And his son continued that tradition. That son, of course, is Ahmad al-Mansur. Ahmad al-Mansur is the most famous Sa'adian sultan, and he was responsible for really developing the Moroccan state in the Sa'adian dynasty. And his relations with England were rather deep and profound. In fact, this picture is actually the picture of his leading diplomat. We don't really have a good picture of him. And that diplomat is believed to have been the source of the character of Othello in the play Othello by Shakespeare. Moroccans were also heavily influential when it came to trade with England, because they were able to provide sugar and cotton in exchange for English weapons. There was also the issue that he wanted to remain independent from the Ottoman Empire. And one of the ways that he did this was to declare himself caliph. The Ottoman Empire at this time, led by Murad III, had already declared themselves the caliphate. They were in control of Mecca and Medina from the year 1517 onwards. And so the declaration by Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur that he was the caliph was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire's claim. This is especially acute because the Sa'adians are Sharifian, right? The Sa'adians are this Arab population, so they are actually legitimate inheritors of the claim that a caliph has to come from the tribe of Quraysh. The Sa'adians claimed they were from the tribe of Quraysh, and so therefore they could legitimately claim to be caliphs, whereas the Ottomans really had to rest on their power over the holy, their power as custodians of the holy mosques in order to claim that title. So Murad III gave permission to Uluj Ali Rais, who was the governor of Algeria, to invade Morocco if Morocco would not submit to being part of the Ottoman Empire. So Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur quickly turned around, paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire, changed the speeches so that they would recognize the Ottoman Empire as the caliph, and proceeded to give an annual gift to the Ottoman Empire in order to call off Uluj Ali Rais. However, once Uluj Ali Rais had died in 1578, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur felt secure enough to stop giving the tribute and to reverse his decisions on the khutbahs, on the speeches in the mosques, and reassert his title as caliph. From that point onward, the Ottoman Empire and the Moroccan state would be rivals, despite both being Muslim states, and often they would turn to Christian states as allies in their fight against one another. One of the largest provocations, at least from the Ottoman side, was that the Moroccans entertained an embassy from Spain. Remember, Spain had launched an invasion of Algeria in 1509, and maintained and had tried to frustrate the Ottoman Empire's attempts to acquire Tunisia in the 1530s. So the Moroccans' friendship towards the Spanish embassy was seen as a direct attack on the Ottoman Empire's hold in Northern Africa. Conversely, Ahmad al-Mansur was very angry about the Ottomans supporting the expansionist dreams of Uluj Ali Rais. So, but not only was he a trader and a military strategist, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur was also a massive builder. And this is Al-Badi' Palace in Marrakesh. Al-Badi' Palace was incredibly astonishing in its original day. I mean, this is how it looks now, and tourists can visit it in Marrakesh. The way it would have looked originally was much closer to the Alhambra in Spain, because it's built by the same types of architectural styles. And the cultivation of gardens within an architectural space in the Islamic world is done primarily to illustrate the power over water and the power over growth, because obviously in a desert, the ability to grow massive gardens is a luxury. Unfortunately, Moulay Ismail, who we might have the chance to talk about today, maybe we'll talk about him next week, stripped all of the edges of the exterior, which is why it looks like this today. But still, it is an impressive reminder of the power that Ahmad al-Mansur wielded. He also didn't start them, but he definitely expanded them. These are the Sa'adian tombs. These are the tombs of Ahmad al-Mansur, you can see in the center, and his forebears. All of the raised plinths refer to one of the Sa'adian monarchs. Now, one of the interesting things is that while Moulay Ismail was willing to rip apart the palace al-Badi' because it was just a palace, he wouldn't dare disturb the dead. So we can actually still see the Sa'adian architecture, the frescoed walls, the columns, all of the original tile work that the Sa'adians made when they created the site The one irony, of course, is that Moulay Ismail, in order to remove the Saadians from the historical record, literally built a wall around the entire complex. And it was only discovered later when airplanes flew over this area and discovered that there was this large patch of land that nobody could access. So we now have to talk a little bit about Songhai. We've talked about a number of African states. We talked about Ouagadougou. We've talked about Mali. The successor to those is Songhai. And the Songhai were led by military generals called the Askia. The Askia was their family name, but they sort of ran the country as a military empire. And they expanded it through the declarations of jihad against other tribes. Now, there were still many animists among the territories controlled by the Songhai, and there weren't forcible conversions, but the Songhai saw the Islamic religion as useful for organizing the empire, and it allowed the importation of scribes who could manage to settle all the documents within the empire. We know several things about how the Songhai Empire was run during the reign of Askia Muhammad II, who was their most powerful leader. We know, for example, that they used cowrie shells as currency, and that they continued the trade of salts for gold, but they decided to cut out the middleman. You can see that the empire went all the way up to Gaza in order to include the Gaza salt mines. We also see that the amount of gold that they were able to bring into the empire was significantly less. Even though they controlled many of the gold mines near Jenne, they were not able to sell all the gold because Europeans had begun to build fortresses along the southern coast of West Africa and trade with other African peoples like the Akan for gold coming from the hinterland. So gold going to the Europeans was simply not going to the Songhai. That said, the Songhai built massive structures. You can see the tomb of Askia Muhammad II on the left-hand side in the city of Gao, which was his capital city. You can also see the University of Sankore in Timbuktu. Now, the University of Sankore already existed by the time the Songhai were in power, but they continued to patronize it and promote it as a school of Islamic learning. And also you have the construction of large mosques and imperial palaces throughout the empire. Now, this is a modern construction in Jenne, made based on the way that the Songhai built their structures. We don't have many pictures of what Songhai cities would have looked like theoretically, but you can imagine buildings similar to the mosque in Jenne. There's a question as to why there are sticks protruding from the sides. That's actually the construction technique. Unlike a lot of areas of the world where there's significant amounts of timber, there wasn't enough timber to actually frame the mud. And so the easier technique was to just layer the sticks almost like rebarb and build the mud around them, and then it would harden and take that shape. So that's actually an intentional part of the structure. So now Ahmad al-Mansur, Ahmad the victorious, the al-Mansur means the victorious. Ahmad al-Mansur was looking towards this gold trade, and he noticed that significant amounts of gold, as I pointed out, were going to Akan. Significant parts were also going to Fezzan in what's modern day Libya. And with the cotton and sugar trade to England, they were able to acquire English arquebuses and English artillery in order to expand their power. They also wanted slaves. A significant portion of the Moroccan army was made of black slaves, similarly to how we discussed with the Egyptian military. And those slaves would be the footmen. Unlike in Egypt, there was no real Mamluk class in Morocco of Turkic mercenaries. There were Turkic mercenaries, but they were not a class. They were much closer to an individual elite that would train Arabs in riding horses. So you would have this unified military of black infantrymen and Arab horsemen that had been expertly trained by both European and Mamluk mercenaries. So, considering the lack of access to gold, Ahmad al-Mansur decided that the right course of action would be to invade the Songhai and recover the gold that way. Now, you have to realize that this is a conquest from one side of the Sahara all the way to the other side of the Sahara. It is a deeply grueling experience. And even though 4,000 cavalry were sent and 10,000 camels, a quarter of that perished en route to the destination. That said, when they finally encountered the forces of the Songhai, we end up with the Battle of Tondibi, which probably takes credit as one of the weirdest battles to have ever been fought in world history. And what basically happened is that coming from the north, coming from Taghaza, where the salt mines were, the Sa'adians were marching towards Gao, and they saw the assembly of the Songhai, which included 20,000 infantry, 15,000 on horseback, and over 1,000 cows. You're not misunderstanding me, cows. And so what the Songhai do is that they try to send the cows after the Moroccans stampeding and use the confusion that would result from those cows stampeding to then attack the Mongol line. The difference, of course, is that the Mongols had artillery. And so the Mongols fired their artillery at the cows. The cows got panicked and turned around, running at the Songhai lines, becoming much more of a liability than an asset. And then the artillery focused on the Sa'adian, the artillery focused on the Songhai cavalry and decimated them quite effectively. The Moroccans had been skilled in the use of drill, which is standing your ground, firing, and firing in waves, so that as one group is reloading, another group is firing. This was effective, very effective in destroying cavalry, and allowed the Sa'adians to reach the city of Gao and to reach the city of Timbuktu and Jenne, and to sack all three cities, bringing immense amounts of gold north to Morocco. But once it became obvious that a cavalry charge against artillery and arquebuses would be an absolute disaster from the side of the Songhai, resistance became much more effective. They were able to close the distance and use tactics other than direct charges in order to effectively keep the Moroccans at bay. As a result, the long-term Moroccan presence in the Niger Bend, right, that corner of the Niger River, where Jenne, Timbuktu, and Gao are, became increasingly difficult. You had successors to the Askia system, like Nuhu, leading a resistance against the Moroccans, and the Moroccans began to install their own rulers in the Niger Bend, and these people began to marry local Songhai populations, and these intermarriages between Moroccans and Songhai were called Arma. The Arma are still an ethnic group that remained in power in this part of Morocco until the 19th century, and there are still Arma alive today. You can see, for example, this is Ali Farka Touré. He's a Malinese singer from the 1960s and 70s, and he is Arma. But what really became the death knell of Morocco holding this territory was just how much it cost to maintain it. All the gold that they kept recovering from the Niger Bend went, in many cases, to the purchase of weapons from England in order to keep the system going. The Moroccans were not producing their own military hardware. And additionally, the convoys across the Sahara were incredibly difficult in order to make, and they couldn't be made routinely, which meant that in the Bend, you began to have the Arma becoming increasingly more and more independent, such that by the time that Ahmad al-Mansur died in 1603, they were basically running their own country called the Pashalik, the Pashalik of Timbuktu. Now, Ahmad al-Mansur died in 1603 because of a plague, and then Morocco was rocked from 1603 pretty much until the 1660s with poor rulers and chronic instability. You have some of the main power centers at this time were Marrakesh and Fez. And for example, after Ahmad al-Mansur died, one of his sons took power in Marrakesh. He was recognized as the legitimate sultan, and the other one took power at Fez. And the two of them would fight each other consistently. Now, I'm pointing out Saleh on this map because Saleh is a very interesting story that I think is worth a second to talk about. Now, the Republic of Saleh, which is across from Rabat, the modern-day capital of Morocco, along the Bouregreg River, was its own republic. And it was a republic formed by Moriscos. Those are Muslims who had lived in Spain. And because Spain had forcibly converted all Muslims to Christianity, they were originally Christians. When they moved to Morocco, they deconverted back to being Muslims. But these Moriscos were specifically from the town of Hornachos, which you can see on this map of Spain in the upper right-hand side. Now, once they had come to Rabat, they began to create their own pirate republic, where they had their own divan or legislature. And similar to Venice, the legislature was appointed by the powerful families, but it represented the interests of the locals, and there was no leading sultan. They also had their own group of pirates. At the very beginning, those pirates were led by Jan Jansun. Jan Jansun was a Dutch man. He had been married several times before. In 1600, he began sailing. At that point, he was captured by the Algerians. He converted to Islam, probably under pressure, but it seems that after his conversion, he was a true believer. He tried to evangelize a number of different people. And Jan Jansun gathered a group of pirates together. They had a number of warships between them, and they called themselves the Saleh Rovers. They would attack other merchant ships and bring them into Saleh, their riches, that is, and that's how they sustained the republic. Eventually, you had the immigration of other Andalusians and other Moriscos who were not from Hornachos, and there were some dynastic disputes resulting in the divan being divided half between Hornacheros, right? Those Andalusians from Hornachos, and the remaining Andalusians. The dominant language of the Republic of Saleh, because these were all Spanish Muslims, was Spanish. It had Arabic loan words, and most of them could speak Moroccan dialect of Arabic because they were conversing with people outside of the Republic. But generally speaking, the language was Spanish by these effective Muslim colonizers. We also have a number of developments to the fortresses along the Atlantic Ocean that would allow ships that were passing by to be within cannon range long before they could actually see the cannons. You can see, for example, this is the Udaya, or the fortress in Rabat, and you can see the Scala on the right-hand side. That's the tower where the cannons can be placed to shoot the ships. And on the top of the left-hand side, you have a semaphore platform where the Saadians who were controlling the fortress could signal the presence of a ship in order for the cannons to fire. This was all organized in a very pristine and exacting way because their method of making money was piracy. But the Saadians were increasingly weak and unable to control their dynasty, which led to all this civil strife, including the development of a rival dynasty, the Alaouites. Now, the Alaouites were originally based in that purple region, in the eastern and southern parts of Morocco. The Alaouites are also Sharifians, right? They're also descended from Arabian populations, and in particular, the Alaouites claim to be descended from Hassan ibn Ali, one of the grandsons of Muhammad, which of course gives them legitimacy if they were to declare a caliphate. And Moulay al-Rashid and his brother were effective in bringing together different coalitions of Moroccans to assist them in the various battles that they fought, starting in the eastern part of Morocco, right, going through the cities of Taza and Fez, then moving up to the northern part of Morocco, very close to Tangier, and then finally taking the city of Marrakesh. Moulay al-Rashid took the city of Marrakesh just before he died. Now, his allies included two, as I said, he was able to put together coalitions of both Arabs and Amazigh. So, for example, you have the Guiche. You can see the Guiche in the upper right-hand side. Those are Arab warring tribes. And the Guiche formed his backbone of his elite forces, but he also recruited from Berbers like the Bnei Snasen, who come from eastern Morocco today, and they are Zenata Berbers. You had his greatest opposition generally came from Masmuda tribes. For example, the Sufi orders in Dila were almost all Masmuda Berbers, and those were his chief rivals. The territory they control is on the map in the yellow area. Once Moulay al-Rashid had unified the majority of the Arab-controlled Moroccan state, he set the stage for his brother, Moulay Ismail, to take power. Now, Moulay Ismail was one of the longest reigning monarchs in Moroccan history. He ruled for 55 years. So he did an incredible amount of things during his reign. He's incredibly famous for many of the wrong reasons, but it's important to sort of go through his accomplishments for both good and ill. The first is that he was deeply distrustful of the Ottomans. The Ottomans paid numerous pretenders to the Moroccan throne in order to try and overthrow Moulay Ismail. And so Moulay Ismail not only had to defeat those pretenders and the rebellions that they caused, but he had difficult relations with Algeria, which was under Ottoman regency. He was also known for imposing significant amounts of corvée labor, especially on prisoners, in order to build the structures that we will see in a bit. Those amounts of man-hour and work were incredibly difficult, especially in his new capital of Meknes, which was a city that he built from practically nothing when he inherited power. And probably his single biggest contribution to Moroccan politics was the creation of the Abid al-Bukhari, or the slaves of Bukhari. And they're called that first because they're slaves. They're since Morocco controlled those areas in the Niger Bend, you had a steady supply of black slaves that were brought to Morocco. These slaves were loyal exclusively to Moulay Ismail and were organized into military units. In many ways, this capturing of slaves, transportation to another country, and isolation of them looks very similar to the Kurchi or to the Janissaries in the Safavid Empire or the Ottoman Empire, respectively, in that you're creating a group of troops loyal exclusively to Moulay Ismail. Now, it's not the case that those were the only troops. Remember, Moulay al-Rashid had managed to create coalitions of Guiche and Berbers, and those coalitions still remained under Moulay Ismail. It's just that the Abid al-Bukhari, those black slaves who were so pious that they kept books by Sunni theologian al-Bukhari on them, were his shock troops and his dominant forces in controlling the internal politics of Morocco and avoiding dissent. Now, he expanded in both the north and the south against numerous enemies. In terms of his southern conquests, he was able to take the cities of Shinqit, Brakna, Tararza, and Taghaza. Taghaza, again, being that city of the salt mines. And because of this, he was able to reconfirm Moroccan power there and make sure that the Pashalik of Timbuktu recognized him as the legitimate Moroccan leaders. This also underlies a lot of modern claims that Moroccans have toward the territory of Western Sahara, since Moulay Ismail integrated it into his country during this time. The conquests to the north are a lot more difficult to organize. Most of them were against the Portuguese. Most of them were against the Spanish that had come to inherit these parts of the Portuguese Empire, like Asila, like Larash, and like Mehdia. But the northernmost point, Tangier, was actually Portuguese until it was sold to the English in 1668 as a wedding present, as part of the dowry, sorry. And so the English led the defense of Tangier at the Battle of Jews Hill. The name is rather ironic, since when the British took power, they expelled all the Jews, fearing that those Jews might be loyal to the Moroccans more so than to the English. And despite several difficult battles that the Moroccans didn't necessarily prevail in, by 1666, Tangier had fallen back into the Moroccan space, and the English had been ejected. Notwithstanding the English losses, the English loss of Tangier, relations between the Moroccans and the English remained cordial, both seeing the importance of their alliance against the Spanish and against the Ottomans. Now, one of the ways that Moulay Ismail generated revenue for all these conquests was the ransoming of hostages. So when he would conquer one of these cities, he would imprison the European soldiers and the European civilians he encountered there, and then ransom them back to Europe. And you can see the Mercedarians, who were a Catholic order, who would go to Morocco and pay the ransom to bring these Christians home to their mother countries. And that stream of wealth, constantly incoming, fueled more conquests and more wars against the Europeans. So it became a vicious cycle that promoted the removal of European coastal cities on the African continent. We mentioned that Moulay Ismail built up the imperial Kasbah of Meknes. Meknes being his new capital, it's relatively close to Fez. And you can see the incredible architecture of the Bab al-Mansur, the door of victory, which is the primary door into the Kasbah, or the military enclosure. Similar to what we saw with the Sa'adian tombs, we have a lot of Andalusian style of architecture, Mudejar style. A lot of geometric tile work, as well as arches. This is the Qubbat al-Khayatin, or the Chamber of Traders. Now, the Chamber of Traders specifically refers to what's below this, physically speaking. But I wanted to show a picture so you can see also the tile work and the intense carving of the upper tiles before they were mounted. There were numerous rooms with this type of tile work in the Kasbah because this was the imperial palace of Moulay Ismail. The reason it's called the Chamber of Traders is that below this was a massive prison complex in which many of the pretenders, the ones that the Ottomans had been supporting, were jailed, as well as those European prisoners pending their being ransomed by the Mercedarians. And so those areas were usually, And finally, we have the mausoleum. This is where Moulay Ismail is actually buried. You can see his burial tomb in the background, in that room below the second chandelier light. And you can also see the incredible tile work, the fountains, the eight-sided star, and the numerous cut-in style of architecture all around the archways. When it came to Oh, that's funny how that happened. When it came to um, Moulay Ismail's personal life, he had a harem of 500 women, and those women, and it is said of Moulay Ismail that he had to have sex every single day, sometimes multiple times per day, and it's unclear how many children he fathered. He certainly fathered the most children of any recorded person, of any recorded person. Um, the smallest number I've seen is 888. The largest number I've seen is 1,100. So it really, leaves open the question: how many kids is too many kids? Apparently, for Moulay Ismail, you can never have too many. Um, and um, there were numerous punishments exacted on anybody aside from the individual eunuch assigned to each of the women in the harem who would look upon those women. Any servant, any petitioner who was any minister who was seen to have looked at a member of his harem was immediately killed. The one exception, as I said, were the eunuchs, and in many cases, petitioners who went to see Moulay Ismail would bow their heads so that way they couldn't see the women and they couldn't be accused of having looked at them. We also have the development of foreign relations by Moulay Ismail. He tried to cultivate relations with France, in particular, sending the ambassador Muhammad Tanim. You can see Muhammad Tanim in this Italian painting, where he's seeing a comedy, an Italian style comedy. However, his flirtation with an alliance with France really broke down in 1718 because of the War of Spanish Succession. Now, the War of Spanish Succession put a Bourbon king, right, a relative of the French King Louis XIV. This is King Felipe V, on the throne of Spain, and that meant that France was now aligned with Spain, and Morocco couldn't have an alliance with any country that had favorable relations with Spain, at least very strongly positive ones. And so they then turned to pursuing better relations with the enemies of the Iberians, both the enemies of both the Spanish and the Portuguese, such as the English and the Dutch Republic. They had treaties with the Dutch Republic as early as 1610, but they reaffirmed their commitment in 1684 with the treaty you see here. We also see that the Republic of Saleh had been integrated into Moulay al-Rashid's Alaouite state, but the Corsairs had now become a part of that state. And so piracy had become part of the revenue generation process for Moulay Ismail. And you can see Corsairs fighting with Europeans in this picture. After Moulay Ismail died in 1727, there was a difficult readjustment as numerous of his sons contended for the throne. It took 30 years before Sidi Muhammad ibn Abdullah, also known as Muhammad III, became the leader, the Sultan of Morocco, and he tried to bring Morocco back into a state of normalcy. He did that by removing the Abid al-Bukhari. In many cases, during that 30-year interim period, the Abid al-Bukhari would choose which of Moulay Ismail's sons would be in power. And so you had shifting between Fez and Marrakesh, you had different alliances, and the Abid al-Bukhari basically were the power behind the scenes. So Sidi Muhammad managed to push them into menial locations and therefore remove them from the process of statecraft. He then set about building more of the country. Thus, he created the first major Moroccan port of Essaouira. It had previously been the Portuguese fort of Mogador, but he substantially expanded it, especially its shipping areas. Another Portuguese city that had fallen to him was the city of Afna. And Afna he didn't take by battle. The Portuguese had abandoned it because there had been an earthquake in Lisbon in I want to say 1750, but it's around there. And the earthquake in Lisbon had effects in Constantinople. In the city of Afna, resulting in the Portuguese really abandoning the city. Sidi Muhammad retook the city and began to build it up as the city of that we now know as Casablanca. And he gave it the name in Arabic that it still carries to this day, which is Dar Bayda, or also White House, just like Casablanca in Spanish. He did lead wars against the Portuguese, though. He besieged the fortress at Masagan. And when he conquered that fortress in 1769, he relabeled the city as El Jadida, meaning the new one. But that was really his only major war. He generally tried to stay away from conflict if he could handle it, including when a French ship of the line started bombarding the Moroccan coast. He sued for peace very quickly, and devolved to the French the pirates that they had been looking for. Probably most interesting to us is the war that are two other situations. Before that, he then moved the capital to Rabat, right where that Republic of Saleh had been. He built the first palace. Now, this is the royal palace in Rabat as it exists today, but he built it in 1785 at first, and that version has been since improved. As I said, there are two interesting situations that are worth talking about. The first one is his failed invasion of Melilla. So he besieged Melilla, which is a Spanish outcrop on the northern part of the African continent. And the siege was nearly 2 years long, with the English helping to form a blockade around the Spanish possessions. The Ottomans actually surprisingly coordinated with the Spanish. We remember that the Ottomans and the Habsburgs have a tenuous relationship, to say the least. But in this case, the Ottomans saw the Spanish defense of Melilla as diverting enough Moroccan troops that they could support the Algerians in pressing further inwards. In order to deal with the Algerians, Sidi Muhammad had to break off the siege and recognize that Melilla was a Spanish possession. However, he did get many of the territories outside of the city walls that had previously been controlled by Spain. All of this in the Treaty of Aranjuez of 1780. But as I said, the most interesting thing probably to the Americans here is that this is the moment where Morocco and the United States enter a treaty of friendship. In 1787, after much prodding on Sidi Muhammad's part, the Americans sign a treaty of friendship that is both written in Arabic and in English. You can see the signature of John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States, on the Treaty of Friendship. It is the first recognition of the United States by any foreign power, because this precedes the Treaty of Paris of except for the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and it is the oldest treaty of friendship that the United States has that is unbroken in its 234 years. One of the interesting things is that the Treaty of Friendship was to facilitate American-Moroccan relations in terms of commerce and trade. The Moroccans under Sidi Muhammad wanting to be more and more open to foreign trade and development, hopefully helping to modernize Morocco in the process. You can also see below George Washington's letter that he wrote to Sidi Muhammad in 1789 upon assuming the presidency. One of the interesting things is that since the American-Moroccan Friendship Treaty was passed in 1787, it was passed when the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which was the first constitution that country had. The Articles of Confederation was a very different organizational system than was promulgated in 1789 under the US Constitution that is currently active. And so George Washington sent this letter at the end of 1789 to reassure the Moroccan leadership that the United States was still going to honor its commitments that it had made during the Articles of Confederation period, namely maintaining the friendship and amity between the United States and the Sultanate of Morocco, and that the United States would request any assistance that the Moroccans could give them in negotiating with the other Barbary states, negotiating with Algeria, Tunis, Tripoli, those states which had been harassing American shipping to a degree the Moroccans were not, and any assistance that could be given to that account. It's something that a lot of Americans forget, but in the early days of the United States, the country had significant debt, and up to 1/5 of the incoming taxes were sent to the Barbary states as tribute payments. So the resolution of that issue, which of course we're going to discuss in more detail next week, was a huge problem for was a huge concern for the United States, considering it was such a large part of the budget. By comparison, today, military and defense spending is less than half of that percentage of the US budget today. All right, questions, comments, concerns? All right, I think I'll close it out then. Next week, we are going to do the 19th century in the Maghreb region. So that includes Morocco, sort of following up on this lecture, everything that happened after Sidi Muhammad, as well as what happened in Algeria and Tunisia. We will then be taking a break of 3 weeks and reconvening in May to discuss the Persians. We also have our European Union series, which will be on the 20th of April, I believe, whatever that Sunday is, where we'll cover more issues related to European Union security. We have our Roman series, and Mark, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I did have to step away for a while, so forgive me if this topic was already covered, but I remember reading some time ago that the Ottomans, I think in the 19th century, or maybe even earlier, got on the idea of factories. They saw that the Europeans were inventing factories, and that the Pasha said, "Go make factories," and they didn't know what to do so much. Does that ring a bell with you?
I mean, we talked about the industrialization in the Ottoman Empire during the Tanzimat period. In many cases, what ended up happening is you had European advisors who assisted with the creation of modern factories and developments, especially with the minority communities. The Greeks were known for, the Greeks and Armenians especially, were known for munitions manufacture. In Egypt, you had a much more thorough modernization, right? We talked about in the 19th century than anything we saw in the Ottoman Empire in terms of its speed and its organization. The problem, of course, is that the Egyptians lost power because of the massive debts that they took out from the great powers, and we covered that about 2 weeks ago. But in Morocco, the period that we're covering is in this up to the 1700s. So the industrialization that hit Europe hasn't even hit Europe yet. Europe is more advanced than Morocco, certainly, in terms of the creation of weapons and munitions. But Morocco is relatively on par with Europe in terms of city organization, sanitation, medicine, these kinds of developments. The real break occurs in the 19th century.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I have a question of why did Moroccans not expand overseas? I covered why the Ottomans didn't expand overseas to a greater extent in, I think, lecture 24, lecture 25. But really, the borders of the Ottoman Empire didn't allow for that. The Moroccans resisted the Ottomans getting access to the Atlantic. The Ottomans did expand over the Indian Ocean. They made strong relations with Indian states like Gwalior, I think. Sorry, the name escapes me. But they even set up what can be called a colony in Aceh, which is modern day Indonesia. As I said, they had alliances with a number of Indian states. Their easiest access to the ocean was the Indian Ocean, but they didn't have access to the Atlantic, and so that made it very difficult for them to colonize. Additionally, it wasn't clear that the New World would be in any way profitable for the Ottoman Empire. The reason that Europeans were interested in it was the promise of gold, but they didn't know where it was, and so that sort of forestalled that option until the Europeans had already found all the gold there was by destroying the two empires that had amassed it. Then the other problem is that the European states have a mercantilist economic system which would reward individuals going and making businesses in the New World and exporting those goods to Europe. There was no similar system in the Ottoman Empire. So the revenue generation model of the Ottoman Empire from the Timurs at that point in the 1500s and 1600s, and from agriculture and peasantry, simply it doesn't create a model that supports colonization in any serious sense, like the Europeans did. So those are the reasons why the Ottomans really didn't expand overseas. Mark, do you have one last question, or you just didn't take your hand down? Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, so I have a question. Can you explain what's going on with Western Sahara? Why is it still a disputed territory, and between whom? Okay. This plays a lot more into what happened in Morocco in the 20th century. So in 1912, for a variety of reasons, the French and the Spanish partitioned the territory of Morocco into two distinct occupation zones, a zone given to Spain and a zone given to Morocco. And those zones, a zone given to France. The French zone was contiguous, the Spanish zone was not. So the Spanish controlled the northern area of Morocco. Actually, if I go back a few slides, so I have a map of all of Africa, it'll be a little clearer. Okay, here we are. So the Spanish zone is this northern area here, and this southern area here, and some small cuts along the coast, like this is Sidi Ifni. And the French zone is everything else that you see. Actually, the Spanish zone extends all the way to the border, I think. So that. So you have these two divided occupation zones. And the Spanish further subdivided their zone along this parallel here. And they called this colony, which roughly is the territory of Western Sahara, they call it Rio de Oro, or River of Gold, despite there not being any gold there. And so Rio de Oro was given a different colonial administration from the rest of Spanish Morocco. Fast forward to 1956. Muhammad V, Sultan of the Alaouite Dynasty, who was still in power, the French decided it was easier to rule Morocco as a protectorate than as a direct territory. And so they left the Alaouite power structure intact. They just required them to take orders from the French governor general. So Muhammad V negotiated the independence of Morocco in 1956. The French were more concerned with what was going on in Algeria. And so they were willing to give the Moroccans independence in exchange for the Moroccans remaining neutral on the Algeria question. So that French area became independent, and it became a negotiation with Spain for the Spanish territories to become part of Morocco. Some of those territories, like most of that northern region, with the exception of Ceuta and Melilla, most of that southern region, except for Sidi Ifni, became part of Morocco pretty much immediately. Those small enclaves did not, and Rio de Oro did not. And so in the mid-1970s, there became an increasing international push for Spain to relinquish its territories in Africa to the Moroccans, especially Sidi Ifni. And there was even a war in 1974 for the retaking of Sidi Ifni. Following this, the Moroccans had a large group of soldiers, and the push was now for Rio de Oro to be made independent in 1975. So this is the international community pressuring the Spanish to end its colonial occupation, not an indigenous revolt of Sahrawi, the people of Sahara, right? Not an indigenous Sahrawi revolt to remove them. So there's no government to whom the Spanish would devolve the independent state. So because there is no movement there, Morocco and Mauritania make an agreement that they will divide Rio de Oro between them. The Moroccans will take the northern 2/3 and basically until about here, and the Mauritanians will take the southern 2/3, basically until about there. And then Algeria basically says, if you do that, we will invade you, because the Algerians preferred a new independent Sahrawi state. That way they could have access to the Atlantic Ocean. And there's also the possibility that there might be more oil in Western Sahara. None has ever been found, but there's always the possibility of oil because Algeria has a lot of natural gas reserves. There's a possibility that some of that might extend. So because of Algeria's threats, Mauritania relinquished its 1/3 and said, we're not going to get involved. We wash our hands of this. The Moroccans in 1975 decided that they would then take the entire region, and they marched from the north all the way to the south in what is called the Green March. And so from 1975 onwards, Morocco controlled the entirety of Western Sahara. That said, the people of Western Sahara speak a different dialect of Arabic from Moroccans. While it's true that the dialects of Arabic differ from town to town and city to city, within Morocco, the Moroccan dialects of Arabic are different from the Hassani dialects of Arabic, which predominate in Sahara. And the Sahrawi, because they had been under Spanish occupation, their dominant European language was Spanish, not French, as opposed to the Moroccans, where in most places, even the areas of Spanish colonization, the dominant European language has switched to French. So we have this situation where now Morocco is in control of a population that is increasingly restive against the Moroccan control. And so a rebellion called the Polisario develops. This Polisario battle results in a ceasefire in 1991. And that ceasefire gives almost all of Western Sahara to the Moroccans effectively, because the ceasefire is pending a treaty. And so basically the Moroccan area of control looks like this. Anything on this side of the border is Moroccan. Anything on this side of the border is Sahrawi, controlled by the Polisario. And the international community wants, generally speaking, the position of the Organization of African Unity, which is sort of like the United Nations of Africa, argues that Western Sahara should be an independent state, ruled by the Polisario. That is the general international view. The United States under Donald Trump has acceded to the Moroccan view, which is that Western Sahara was a part of Morocco, unlawfully split from Morocco during the 1912, and therefore now lawfully reintegrated to Morocco as as 3 Moroccan provinces. And Donald Trump is believed to have made this concession to the Moroccans in order to secure their assent to the Abraham Accords, which created peace between Morocco and Israel. So does that, Cassidy, does that explain the debate? Generally speaking, the most prominent advocate of the Polisario is modern day Spain, right? They see this as the fruition of their colony trying to achieve independence. And so this has, and that in addition to those 2 Spanish cities that are still on the Moroccan coast, Ceuta, originally Portuguese, right, but given to the Spanish in the 1660s, and Melilla, which had been Spanish since 1497, that combined with the Sahara situation inflames Moroccan-Spanish relations. And so it's a little bit difficult for those countries to negotiate on those issues. All right. If there's nothing further, I think we should call it a night. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'll see you next week then.